Thanks for your patience, and thank you for coming out this morning to join us for this next installment in our Curators Colloquial series. I want to welcome everyone, those here and those at home. Very glad to have you with us. These programs are designed to expand on the themes and subjects that we show in our special exhibition, A Nation, a City and Its First Library, Americana as a Way of Life at the St. Louis Mercantile Library for 175 years. And for those of you who've been downstairs, probably for more than one visit, you'll recognize that even as sprawling an exhibition as this one cannot possibly address the many important female figures in history that need to be brought to our attention. And so what I would like to point out too is that a lot of people who are new to meeting the Mercantile are surprised to find out that we had women members from our earliest days. And so I'm really excited to have as our topic today, have a speaker with us today to really address those women's stories. I'm really pleased to introduce Sarah Hodge, curator of the Herman Teapot National Inland Waterways Library and Special Collections Librarian. She's going to speak to us about some of these remarkable women and the stories that are preserved here in our fine art, rare book, and archival collections. So please join me in welcoming Sarah to the podium.
Thank you, Julie. Let me just share my screen for a moment. I'm so thrilled to be here today, exploring this topic with all of you. Thank you for attending. Before we start, sorry, I'm just gonna take my mask off. I am vaccinated and I'm kind of away from you guys. Before we start, I want to challenge you all to imagine a woman in St. Louis in the 19th or early 20th centuries. No, really, humor me. Close your eyes if you need. Picture someone in those early years when the Mercantile was still new, or back in the 1850s and 60s and 70s, or at the turn of the century and into the 20s and 30s. What did she look like? How did she behave? How did she dress? What did she do with her life? How did she speak and interact with others? Do you see her? Hold that image in your mind. We'll revisit it at the end of the presentation. With that, we have some amazing stories to discover, so let's just dive right in. I want to start this talk with a simple fact. Women are amazing. We just are. We've done incredible things. We've been to space. We discovered radioactivity in DNA's double helix. We invented the ice cream maker, life rafts, and windshield wipers. We've been artists and activists, educators, leaders, and innovators. On and on I could go. Now, you may be thinking, hey, men have done some pretty great things too. And that's undoubtedly true. But today we're here to give voice to the voiceless, to explore those stories undiscovered or unrecognized or long since forgotten. Women's stories deserve to be told and told again, and they deserve an audience to inspire and impassion. The news we hear, the art we look at, and the literature we read help to shape not only our individual perspectives, but also the world we live in. Historically, societies across the globe have elevated works by men while marginalizing or misrepresenting the works of women. This creates a male-dominated lens in which we view and understand our shared past and present. Now, it's one thing to say this, but another to consider what it really means. History is a social construct. There is no, for lack of a better way to say it, one true history. Our shared history is the stories we tell each other of generations long gone. It's the harrowing tales of events threatening us with transformation, for better or worse. It's the documents and objects we preserve and carry with us year after year, mile after mile. The stories we've managed to save and record are monumentally eclipsed by those lost to the sands of time. And that is to say nothing of individual bias, prejudice, and differing cultural perspectives of the storytellers. Yes, history is a many-faceted gem, or perhaps it's more like a shattered mirror. We collectively pick up and carry shards with us, reassembling a fragment of what once was. But inevitably, some of those pieces get left behind or misplaced. As historians, it's our job to try to reassemble the mirror, We go out into the community and find missing shards, which we analyze and interpret, trying to find where they fit in with the pieces we've already collected and preserved. Today, when we look into the mirror we've created of our shared local, national, or global history, we see a distorted reflection. Certain perspectives have been left out, while others have been given a misleading prominence through this omission. This is why it's so critical we explore the stories of women and minorities. It's not that the stories of men matter less. The sad reality is, if we don't collectively find and preserve those missing mirror fragments, they'll be lost to us. And that would be a disservice, not only to ourselves, but to all those who come after us. As St. Louis's oldest cultural institution, the Mercantile Library has hosted remarkable women throughout its 175-year history. The library's diverse collections preserve stories that celebrate the authentic lives and experiences of these women. In this presentation, we'll explore the legacy of women at the Mercantile, how their gender identity influenced their storytelling, and how their contributions and achievements recontextualize our shared past, present, and future. A quick note, all of the images used in this presentation represent a real physical object in the library's collections. I have many more displayed up here on the table that aren't pictured in the presentation. These aren't just books, and they aren't just significant because they are collectible first editions. They are, to keep the analogy going, mirror shards of history. Each one is a real physical object that someone bought or was given, read, discussed, was influenced by, and passed on. Many are signed by the owners or include inscriptions with dates. It's amazing to think when I'm handling these, I'm turning the pages of the same books that inspired, entertained, and educated individuals more than 100 years ago. In the early days of the library, the leaders had one driving goal: to be a place of culture and enlightenment for the betterment of St. Louis. To achieve this, they collected voraciously, staged exhibitions, loaned books out into the community, and organized lectures and public programs. The library was a place of learning and discussion. The library's 1853 annual report describes a successful docket of lectures for the year, including by Ralph Waldo Emerson. The library president reported, "Let us rejoice in the rewarding reflection that the Mercantile Library Association has contributed in no small degree to the removal of reproach from St. Louis that here an audience could not be gathered for any more dignified purpose than to witness the marvels of some wandering magician. We mean no disparagement to healthy modes of improvement and to healthy modes of recreation, but pleasure and recreation unmingled with improvement and instruction have been evidently too greatly sighed for by our population. The influence of such an association as you've entrusted to our care cannot but be felt." When the library moved into its second building in 1854, it included a magnificent 2,000-seat grand hall. It was the largest auditorium in St. Louis at the time. The Mercantile hosted performers and speakers from around the world. Within that hallowed hall, plays were staged, operas sung, even slavery abolished, legally for the state of Missouri at least. It was in this hall our first leading lady of today's presentation took the stage. A young girl, no older than 11, she captivated the people of St. Louis with her otherworldly voice. The great composer Giuseppe Verdi often described her as the finest singer who had ever lived. He wrote of her, "She is an artist by nature, so perfect that perhaps there has never been her equal." I introduce to you the incomparable Adelina Petty. Adelina was practically born on the stage. No, really, her mother, soprano Caterina Barilli, was singing Norma in Madrid when she went into labor, just before the last act. Adelina was the youngest child of accomplished tenor Salvatore Petty. In 1846, when Adelina, the same year the Mercantile was founded, when Adelina was still a babe, the family moved from their native Italy to New York City. Salvatore had been invited by a friend to help him run a new opera house. Adelina grew up surrounded by music. Her 5 older sisters and brothers and both parents were extremely accomplished musicians. She described her childhood in her autobiography. A musical ear, as well as an aptitude for and great love of singing, was developed in me at an extremely early age. Even as a little child, I was madly fond of music and the stage. I went to the opera every evening my mother appeared. Every melody, every action was impressed indelibly on my mind. When, after being brought home, I had been put to bed, I used to quietly get up again and by the light of the night lamp, play over all the scenes I had witnessed in the theater. A cloak of my father's with a red lining and an old hat and feathers belonging to my mother did duty as an extensive wardrobe, and so I acted, danced and twittered, barefooted but romantically draped, all the operas. As Adelina grew, her family became more and more aware of her burgeoning talent until at the age of 7, they set her upon the table and instructed her to sing an entire piece for them. She performed Casta Diva, an extremely difficult aria from Bellini's Norma, the same opera her mother was performing when she went into labor with her. The 7-year-old Adelina brought her family to tears with her art. Having never been trained or received a single formal lesson, her voice was incredible. Her imitative gift allowed her to not only learn every bar, every note and syllable of the Italian music and text by heart, but also to control her tone, to sustain it without effort, and to deliver the phrases as she had heard them sung with natural expression and balance. At this time, the family was struggling financially. The opera house had never earned well. When the manager declared bankruptcy and disappeared, the company dispersed and the opera house closed. Salvatore and Caterina would have been fools not to recognize the enormous earning potential of their youngest daughter. She gave her first public performance that same year at a charity concert at Tripler's Hall in New York. After that, in 1850, she set off on a 3-year provincial tour with her 25-year-old brother-in-law, Maurice Strakosch. Strakosch had been a child prodigy himself, an accomplished pianist who made his debut at the age of 11. He skyrocketed to considerable fame in Austria and Germany and had only recently returned to New York after a tour of the States. And so it was, the pair set out to tour every major city throughout the US, Canada, Mexico, and Cuba. At one of the earliest concerts in Baltimore, Strakosch came across an old friend, the accomplished Norwegian violinist Ole Bull. Ole Bull was a virtuoso of the Paganini school and was incredibly popular in the United States. He joined forces with Strakosch and Adelina, creating one of the most sought-after shows of the 19th century. Night after night, the young Adelina sang from atop a table, mesmerizing audiences across the country. It's important to remember Adelina was a person, not just an emotionless name in history. She was still a child despite her gift. In 1886, Strakosch published his memoir, Souvenirs d'un Impresario. In it, he describes an episode where Adelina threw a tantrum just before taking the stage. She had asked Strakosch to buy her a doll, a request he ignored to his peril. Adelina refused to perform despite a full house until Strakosch relented and rushed to the nearest toy store. Naturally, their tour eventually carried the trio to St. Louis. And where else would she perform in the great river city, but at the brand new, magnificent Mercantile Library Hall? If you'll bear with me just a moment, I'm going to switch to the camera. News of her performance can be found in the popular St. Louis newspaper, Revue de l'Ouest. The Revue was actually founded that same year and was the first French newspaper in St. Louis. I want to show you the physical clipping, so bear with me a moment while I get this open. Here we can see the beautiful masthead of the Revue. It always amazes me how superior this old paper was to modern day newsprint. The pages are so supple and strong and soft. Clippings much more recent than this are usually cracking, flaking all over the place, regardless of how well you preserve them. And right here, we can see the article that announced her performance. It's the Review from March 11th, 1854. It's of course in French, but it reads, Monsieur Ole Bull arrived on Thursday and gave his first concert that evening in the Mercantile Library Hall with a young prodigy, Adelina Petty. There was a large audience despite the bad weather. The second and last concert will take place tonight. Adelina's performance at the Mercantile was one of her last as a youth. She stopped performing in public when she turned 12. Strakosch and her parents wanted to give her voice time to develop and form. It wasn't until 1859, when she was 16, that she made her operatic debut at the Italian Opera in New York. Adelina went on to tour Europe and became internationally renowned as one of the greatest sopranos of all time. She sang at music capitals and royal palaces across Europe. One of the world's finest celebrity superstars, her voice, clothing, personality, love interest, and lifestyle made headlines in newspapers across the globe. At her peak, she commanded $5,000 a night. I want to show you a glass plate negative of Adelina in the library's collection. The image of her as a child I had on the earlier slide was also a glass plate negative in this collection, and it's on display up at the table. If you haven't seen one of these before, they're pretty incredible. Negatives, as you probably know, are created when light is focused through a camera lens and lands on light-sensitive material. In this case, the material is a chemical solution spread over a glass plate. When she retired, Adelina, then Baroness Cedarstrom, purchased a castle in South Wales where she had her own private theater. It was there in 1905 and 1906 that she cut more than 30-disc gramophone recordings of songs and operatic arias. By then, she was 62 years old with her voice well past its prime after a lifetime of performing. The quality of these early recordings is quite poor as well, but through them, you can recognize how amazing she must have been live in the height of her career, or how magical it must have been for those early Mercantile Library members and patrons to hear young Adelina perform as a child. I don't think it'd be fair to talk about this great songstress and not let you hear her art. I listened to her sing as I read and wrote about her life, and it was such a joy to get to know her in this way. Although we have a large sheet music collection, we don't have her early recordings, so I'm going to share 2 free-to-use samples on the Internet Music Archive. The first is a clip from La Serenata. I'm being told it's a little loud. Oh, it can go up some, okay. The next clip is of the Jewel song from Faust. I'll warn you, it starts at a high note, which is an awkward place for someone to have cut it, but what follows demonstrates her extraordinary control. Okay. As much as I could listen to that all day. 6 years after little Adelina performed at the library, another larger-than-life performer took the stage, but this one was no child. Long before she ever stepped foot in St. Louis, its citizens would have spent years consuming sensational tales of her adventures across Europe, of her bigamous second marriage to an army officer 8 years her junior, of her life in the Munich palace, where she bathed in lavender and dried herself with rose leaves, of Parisian gentlemen paying her $10,000 for a single evening's entertainment. The mystery and scandal were part of the allure of the one and only Lola Montez. Lola was actually born Marie Dolores Eliza Rosanna Gilbert. She was the daughter, which none of those names had the word Lola or Montez in them. She was the daughter of a British Army officer and an Irish aristocrat. By the age of 16, she was already surrounded by scandal and known for her determination and temper. When she learned her mother planned to marry her to a 46-year-old widower in India, Marie instead eloped with one of her mother's friends, Lieutenant Thomas James. Their marriage lasted just 5 years. The couple separated, and Marie decided to reinvent herself. She took a new name, Lola Montez, claimed Spanish heritage, and became a professional dancer. Now, interestingly, I don't mean she spent the next several decades of her life studying dance, practicing, and fighting her way to the top to achieve her dreams and aspirations of being a professional dancer. No, I mean practically overnight, she reinvented herself as a dancer. Unlike the naturally gifted Adelina, Lola was not described as a talented dancer, yet she captivated large audiences with her beauty, notoriety, and eccentric erotic dancing. She had two failed debuts in London and Paris, but still had no difficulty booking shows throughout Europe. Her dancing was heavily criticized as mediocre, and some audiences would heckle and laugh at her performances. But the scandals she surrounded herself with continued to draw large crowds. She smoked cigarettes in public, which was shameful for women well into the 20th century. She took numerous lovers, despite still legally being married to her first husband. Many a fatal duel was fought for her attention. She was surrounded by mysteries and rumors, some of which she started herself. Was she the daughter of a Spanish nobleman or a Spanish gypsy, or of the Sultan of Turkey, or of Lord Byron himself? Lola was also well known for her hot-headed temper. She would often carry a whip around to use on critics and naysayers. Once she pulled a knife from her garter on police in Warsaw and was eventually banished from Poland. She rarely stayed in one place long, flitting around the European continent, leaving social upheaval in her wake. While on tour in Munich, she captured the heart of King Ludwig I of Bavaria. He took her as his mistress and lavished her with large amounts of money, chests of jewels, carriages, and houses. She grew to hold incredible political influence with her ability to sway the king. She influenced many staffing decisions at the palace and earned countless enemies at court, including the king's principal advisor and Secretary of the Interior, Karl von Abel. Abel had Lola investigated, uncovering many of her lies, even other lovers, but it wasn't enough to sway the king. Abel was ultimately dismissed, and the king even disbanded the government, who refused to give Lola a title as a non-citizen. Ludwig appointed a new ministry, which was more Protestant and liberal, then named Lola the Countess of Lansfeld. Lola is largely credited with the king's loss of public support and for fanning the flames of the 1848 revolution. She eventually fled the country for Switzerland. Ludwig abdicated his throne in favor of his son to follow his lover, but she betrayed him and tossed him aside, leaving his life in ruins. Next, Lola moved to London and took on a second husband. Her first husband was still very much alive in India, of course, but she claimed she was a widow in the marriage registry. She was later arrested for bigamy and had to flee yet another country. Having burned her way through most of Europe, Lola decided to try her luck in America. She arrived in New York City in 1851 and launched a tour of the eastern states with her play Lola Montez in Bavaria, where she starred as herself in a dramatic retelling of her life and adventures in Ludwig's court. Lola enjoyed success touring the East Coast, causing sensation everywhere she went. She primarily performed playbills, but would often do her infamous spider dance at the end of the show. In the dance, she pretended to be overrun by a swarm of spiders that filled her skirts. Trying to shake the arachnids off, she would dance with increasing fury and violence, stomping on the spiders as they fell, while lifting her skirts high so the audience could see her ankles and calves. When I said erotic dancing, that was what I meant. Back then, that was erotic. Sometimes she would even assume the role of the spider herself and leap around the stage. She performed in St. Louis in 1853 at the Variety Theater, broadside of which is in the collections here at the Mercantile. It's for the best she performed at the Variety rather than the Mercantile's newly constructed Grand Hall. Her first night in St. Louis, she flogged the manager of the theater and broke his nose with a candlestick after he shared concerns about how her pantomime performance had been poorly received. It wasn't until 1860 that Lola would take the stage at the Mercantile. By this time, she was 40 years old, and much of her fiery antics had mellowed with age. She had begun withdrawing from public life and grown increasingly religious while losing much of her great fortune and influence. She didn't perform for the library as a dancer or actress. Instead, she gave lectures on fashion, women, and one titled John Bull at Home. Her performance received poor reviews. It's easy to imagine many in the audience may have had unrealistic expectations of this mythical figure. Interestingly, she isn't mentioned in the library's annual report of the year's lectures. Less than a year later, Lola suffered a stroke and died days later. Much like Adelina, Lola's life was splashed across the pages of newsprint around the world. Intimate, private details like her love affairs with Franz Liszt and Alexandre Dumas came to define her. It's important to recognize, though, that there was more to her, much more than these journalists would have reported at the time. Journalists sought to sell papers, and sensationalism and scandals certainly sell. Lola was also known, albeit by far fewer people, to help the needy and carry food and medicine to injured miners. She sat up all night with sick children and confidentially endeared herself to many during her lifetime. She even gave singing and dance lessons to local children and was known to visit schools. But none of that was quite as entertaining as destroying a Bavarian monarchy or as engaging as bigamy. Remember that shattered and mirror analogy I spoke of earlier? What stories survive and what get lost? What might have been misinterpreted or influenced by the bias of the storyteller? What do we choose to remember now as storytellers ourselves? And how might we view those stories differently had a male lead been cast in her role? The smoking in public, the love affairs, involving herself in politics. She sounds a bit like a rock star, right? The women of the Mercantile weren't relegated to only entertainment, and Lola was far from the only woman to lecture at the library. In 1873, the Mercantile welcomed a celebrated abolitionist and author with over 30 books penned to her name, one of which is often credited as a contributing cause of the American Civil War. I give you the brilliant Harriet Beecher Stowe. Harriet was born in Connecticut in 1811. She was the daughter of a prominent Congregationalist minister and the sixth of 11 children. Her mother, a deeply religious woman, died when she was 5. At the age of 13, Harriet enrolled in Hartford Female Seminary, a school run by her older sister, Catherine. She studied classics, languages, and mathematics, and went on to teach there after graduating. In 1832, Harriet moved with her family to Cincinnati, Ohio, where her father had become the president of Lane Theological Seminary. There she taught at another school founded by her sister and contributed stories and sketches to local journals. It was also in this booming river town that she came face to face with the ugly institution of American slavery. She observed people escaping enslavement and the bounty hunters desperately tracking them, as well as enslaved communities across the river in Kentucky. She quickly developed strong and outspoken anti-slavery beliefs. In 1836, Harriet married widower Reverend Calvin Aldous Stowe, a professor of biblical literature at the seminary. The two went on to have 7 children together, including twin daughters. The couple lost one of their children, their 18-month-old son, and Harriet later credited the experience as further inflaming her abolitionist sentiment. She wrote, "Having experienced losing someone so close to me, I can sympathize with all the poor, powerless slaves at the unjust auctions." On March 9, 1850, Harriet wrote to the editor of the weekly anti-slavery journal, The National Era, that she planned to write a story about the problem of slavery. "I feel now that the time has come when even a woman or a child who can speak a word for freedom and humanity is bound to speak. I hope every woman who can write will not be silent." Her tale was published serially from 1851 to 1852 and appeared in book form later that year as Uncle Tom's Cabin. The book explored American slavery, the treatment of enslaved people, and the idea that human beings cannot own one another as property. The novel follows 2 plot lines, and while one ending is happy, the other shows the brutal death of a slave at the hands of his master. Uncle Tom's Cabin was an immediate sensation, celebrated in the North and cursed in the South. Over 300,000 copies were sold in the first year. The book was translated widely and dramatized several times. Harriet's writing opened the eyes of people around the world to the horrors of American slavery. Uncle Tom's Cabin quickly became the best-selling novel of the entire 19th century, the title it still holds to this day. Unsurprisingly, in the South, Harriet was ridiculed and abused as out of touch, arrogant, ignorant, and guilty of slander. Her writing sparked a wave of backlash, including reviews, responses to those reviews, and responses to those responses. The wave of books published in opposition to Stowe's writing are called anti-Tom novels today. They largely attempt to show slavery in Southern society in a more positive light. Many claim that slavery was actually beneficial to the enslaved. To be candid, I found it disturbing to read some of the reviews of Uncle Tom's Cabin. They sound eerily familiar and use the same language as conversations I've heard today about fake news. In the years that followed, Harriet continued to write and publish an impressive amount and variety of works, though her anti-slavery sentiment appears as a common thread throughout. In 1853, she published A Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin, which compiled research and testimonies in support of her indictment of slavery, and it's on display on the table up here. In 1856, she published Dread, A Tale of the Great Dismal Swamp, which depicted the deterioration of a society reliant on slavery, and was also turned into a play. She even published a romance novel in 1859. The Minister's Wooing follows a girl who believes her lover was lost at sea and depicts her struggle as she decides whether or not to marry another man. After the start of the Civil War, Harriet traveled to Washington, D.C., where she met President Lincoln on November 25, 1862. Her son later claimed Lincoln greeted her by saying, "So you are the little woman who wrote the book that started this great war." Even after slavery was abolished, Harriet continued to fight for the improvement of the lives of formerly enslaved people. Her 1873 book, Palmetto Leaves, is a travel guide and memoir which documents the time she spent in Jacksonville, Florida, where she owned a cottage. Parts of the book relate the lives and customs of African Americans in the region. It is one of the first travel guides written about Florida, which by then was mostly wilderness. The book is credited with encouraging Florida's tourism and residential development. During 1872 and 73, Harriet tried her hand at the lecture circuit. Her first tour took her through New England, reading excerpts from her many publications. Her second tour took her through the Midwestern states, where she naturally paid a visit to the Mercantile Library in St. Louis. Here on the left, you can see an advertisement announcing her upcoming lecture in the St. Louis Democrat October 9th issue, and also a review of her performance in the October 16th issue. The review reads, "Mercantile Library Hall was about 2/3 filled last evening by an audience eager to listen to Mrs. Harriet Beecher Stowe's reading. The lady was introduced by Judge Speck, president of the Mercantile Library Association. She was dressed in exceedingly good taste. Her hair was very becomingly arranged. Her dress was an elegant black silk with surplice front with a corsage bouquet fastened with a diamond and onyx pin. She wore lavender kids and assisted her sight when she had occasion to refer to her notes with a pair of eyeglasses. A considerable change was made in the program. The first part was omitted, the second part was read first, and the vacancy thus caused filled with scenes from Uncle Tom's Cabin, introducing little Eva, St. Clair, Miss Ophelia, and Topsy. The selections from Old Town Stories and the Minister's Wooing were decidedly the best things of the evening." The Daily Globe, another St. Louis paper in our collections, reported that the woman to whom the colored race in the United States owe their freedom, in a great measure, deserves a higher place in history than Joan of Arc or Cleopatra. Now, I don't think anyone owes their freedom to anyone else, but I do think this review speaks to how highly regarded she was and to the significance of her speaking at the Mercantile Library. Harriet's daughter, Hattie, who had come along to help her mother, wrote a letter home to her twin sister on October 19th, describing how she found St. Louis under the smoke like Hades and the Mississippi, the river Styx. She went on to explain how the good house at the reading somewhat cheered her up. I'll be honest, I have no clue what she's talking about, but I found her description funny, and as the waterways curator, had to share it. I guess there was a lot of fog coming off the Mississippi when they visited. Following the death of her husband, Calvin Stowe, in 1886, Harriet's health started to rapidly decline. In 1888, the Washington Post reported that she developed dementia. Today, most researchers believe she suffered from Alzheimer's disease. Mark Twain, one of her neighbors in Hartford, recalled the last years of her life in his autobiography. Her mind had decayed and she was a pathetic figure. She wandered about all day long in the care of a muscular Irish woman. Among the colonists of our neighborhood, the doors always stood open in pleasant weather. Mrs. Stowe entered them at her own free will, and as she was always softly slippered and generally full of animal spirits, she was able to deal in surprises, and she liked to do it. She would slip up behind a person who was deep in dreams and musings and fetch a war whoop that would jump that person out of his clothes. And she had other moods. Sometimes we would hear gentle music in the drawing room and would find her there at the piano singing ancient and melancholy songs with infinitely touching effect. Harriet Beecher Stowe died on July 1st, 1896. Many of Harriet's works, including those pictured in this presentation and those on this table, and many more beside, are preserved in the Helen Nash collection. I started working here a little over a year ago, and this is one of the first times I've had the privilege of working with this incredible collection, collected by yet another amazing woman of the Mercantile. Dr. Helen Nash, who was born in 1921, was a prominent St. Louis physician and assembled over 1,000 books and pamphlets documenting the African-American and Black experience throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. It's an incredibly powerful and deep collection that I highly recommend. Women were invited to be members and patrons of the library since it first opened. They didn't just present lectures and perform. They were also in the audience. They read the books and used the collections for research. Many went to the Mercantile simply for the environment, to spend their time in a place of culture and learning, to engage in discourse, and to connect with other people in their community. This was the case for our next incredible woman, one whose romantic prose made hearts skip across the nation. I'm speaking of the lyrical Sarah Teasdale. Sarah was born in St. Louis in 1884. Her parents had her late in their lives, being 40 and 45, and the youngest of her 3 older siblings was 17. She was born into one of those old established families with great wealth that trace their lineage back to a Puritan who founded the town of Concord, Massachusetts in 1653. Sarah grew up in a picturesque mansion on Lindell Boulevard, which her parents designed with the help of an architect. She was homeschooled until she turned 9, then attended Ella Dean Lockwood's School for Small Boys and Girls, 1 block from her home. There she kept a notebook for years of all the books she had read, starting with Little Women, Jack and Jill, and Old Fashioned Girl. Later, Sarah attended Mary's Institute, then Hosmer Hall. At her 1903 graduation, the undergraduates sang the class poem, which was, of course, written by young Sarah. Sarah graduated into a city oozing with culture and arts, much changed from the desert the early founders had sought to fill. There were several universities, the St. Louis School of Fine Arts, the City Art Museum of St. Louis, the St. Louis Artists Guild, the Olympic Theater, the Outdoor Municipal Theater, also known as the Muni, and of course, the already historic St. Louis Mercantile Library. In 1904, Sarah and her friends decided to start a club called the Potters. It was a club designed to improve their creative talents through mutual help and criticism. Sarah's friend, Wilhelmina Parrish, who was an accomplished musician and artist, took the lead. The girls started a monthly magazine to showcase their creative works with Wilhelmina as editor. For the next 3 years, the girls published their original literary and artistic creations, printing, binding, and decorating the covers by hand. This 1910 St. Louis publication includes a collection of poems from the Potter's Wheel. In 1905, Sarah took some time off from her club to travel with her mother to Egypt, Greece, Italy, and England. Like I said, she was privileged. She learned a lot on that trip, and I think it influenced a lot of her later writing. After her return, she continued writing and published for the magazine Reedy's Mirror. It didn't take long for William Reedy, the editor of Reedy's Mirror, to hear about the Potter's Wheel, which was spreading in popularity across the region. He was particularly drawn to Sarah's work, and on May 30th, 1907, he published some of her prose, which skyrocketed her into the national spotlight and really launched her career as a professional writer. Again, bear with me a moment. I'm just going to share the camera and we will look at the actual Reedy's Mirror publication where Sarah's poem was first published. Here again, we can see a beautiful masthead. Wonderfully decorated title page. And down here, we can see Sarah's first poem that was published and brought her to national acclaim, Guinevere. In later years, Wilhelmina recalled those early days writing and publishing the Potter's Wheel, speaking fondly of the time she and Sarah spent at the Mercantile. For many years, she and I had a rendezvous every Friday morning in the dear old St. Louis Mercantile Library, where we sat in a secluded window niche and talked of shoes and ships and sealing wax, of cabbages and kings. And then we would browse among the tempting shelves of books, always seeking new nourishment for our eager young minds. Sarah published her first collection of poems, Sonnet to Dews, in 1907, followed by Helen of Troy in 1911. Her 1915 Rivers to the Sea was his bestseller and was reviewed by the New York Times as a little volume of joyous and unstudied song. Critics found Sarah's poetry simple, but full of musical language and powerful emotion. Just before Rivers to the Sea was published, Sarah married Ernst Filsinger, a longtime admirer of her poetry. She had enjoyed a brief courtship with the poet Vachel Lindsay, but they agreed he couldn't provide for her. Sarah and Ernst moved to New York City together in 1916, where she resided the rest of her life. She published Love Songs in 1917, which won the inaugural Columbia University Poetry Society Prize, later renamed the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry, and also won the Poetry Society of America Prize. Sarah continued to grow and evolve as an artist, with her later works praised as some of her best, including Flame and Shadow in 1920, Dark of the Moon in 1926, pictured here, and Stars Tonight in 1930. It was really difficult for me not to read to you a million of Sarah's poems. I loved them all, but this one I felt incredibly drawn to, and I want to share it. There will be stars over the place forever. Though the house we loved and the street we loved are lost, every time the earth circles her orbit, on the night the autumn equinox is crossed. Two stars we knew poised on the peak of midnight will reach their zenith, stillness will be deep. There will be stars over this place forever. There will be stars forever while we sleep. The years before Stars Tonight was published, Sarah divorced her husband and rekindled her friendship with Lindsay, who was then married with children. At this point, Sarah's health began deteriorating rapidly. She suffered depression and anxiety, and after a particularly bad bout of pneumonia, she took her own life in 1933 by overdosing on barbiturates. Her final collection of verse, Strange Victory, was published posthumously that same year and is widely regarded as one of her finest. Sarah's lyrical poetry reflected her life experiences, recounting a woman's changing perspectives of beauty, love, and death. It is fascinating and moving to trace her story in tandem with her writing, to see how the pair dance together. And I love the idea that the early days spent reading and discovering at the Mercantile contributed to the beauty behind her work. So far, we've only talked about one side of the coin here. Women have also helped shape and create the library from behind the scenes as donors, board members, and staff. In 1958, Mary Dorward became the first female librarian after Clarence Miller. Women had been clerks and had held other assistant positions before, but being the librarian was different. This person was responsible for actively growing and managing the collections, crafting and shaping the library, while maintaining the legacy left by those who came before. It is an honor my fellow curators and I share today, and one we don't take lightly. Mary was born in Scotland and raised by her great aunt. Since her mother died not long after her birth, Mary and her sister traveled to the United States to join their father when she was 10. She later got her degree in library science from the Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, then went on to work at the Brooklyn Art Museum in 1941 as their reference librarian. In an interview for the Globe Democrat announcing her appointment at the Mercantile, she described her time in Brooklyn. The work at the museum was most absorbing, and we put greatest emphasis on making people acquainted with the library, stressing its value to college faculties and students. She goes on to admire the new library she would work at for the next 7 years. The Mercantile's membership fee is certainly most reasonable, and the delivery service, bringing books right to your door, is something I have never heard of anywhere. If more people realize what a fine library this is, with 200,000 books on every subject, from fiction to science, bound newspaper files, periodicals, and a reference department containing invaluable records and volumes on early St. Louis, I believe they would be anxious to become members. During her career at the library, Mary had the privilege of organizing the signature event for the city of St. Louis, celebrating the 200th anniversary in 1964. The event was attended by important people from all over the country, including Harry Truman. Wonderfully, Mary Dorward was succeeded by another female head librarian, Elizabeth Kirschner, who went on to serve at the library for the next 2 decades. Elizabeth was originally from Southern Illinois and came to the library after being a teller at Sticks, Bayer, and Fuller. She was hired as an assistant cataloger by Mr. Miller and went on to run the issue desk, then stepped into Mary's shoes when she left. The Mercantile's current director, John Hoover, who worked with her for many years, described her to me as a student of the past. He said you could hear echoes of the past through her in the way she described the history of the library, like you were hearing those early members and founders. There are so many more amazing stories I'd love to explore with you, but sadly, this is all we have time for today. I also researched and wrote about Susan B. Anthony and the Women's Suffrage Association. We actually have a letter from Susan to our library requesting to reserve a space for a meeting of her fellow activists. I wrote about Sally Benson, Sarah Peel, Kate Chopin, and Harriet Hosmer, all of who are strongly represented in our collections. And I had a list of dozens of other women whose stories I wanted to explore. including Phoebe Cousins, the first woman lawyer in the United States, who lectured at the library on women's rights, and Anne Eliza, the last wife of Brigham Young, who spoke at the Mercantile about the evils of Mormonism, or Anne Ella Carroll, one of President Lincoln's spies and confidential advisors during the Civil War. I considered presenting a brief survey of lots of women, brushing over their major accomplishments and where their lives intersect with the Mercantile, then moving on. But I think that type of history tends to be part of the problem. Instead, I wanted to take the time to introduce these amazing people to you properly. I wanted to let you get to know them using our collections, to see the real people behind the stories. And the true joy of a collection like the Mercantile's is that the research is never done. The library's collections are constantly growing and expanding, to say nothing of the 175 years worth of collections we already preserve. You could spend a lifetime here and still be surprised and learn something new every day. Many people have. I barely broke the surface on this subject. The newspapers and annual reports, the correspondence and visitor logs. There's just so much to explore, and I invite all of you to join me on this journey of discovery. Many of these collections can be accessed online through our digital library or by contacting the reference room for a research appointment. Before we wrap up, I want you to recall that woman I asked you to picture at the start of this presentation. Remember her? Be honest. How flat was your image before? How has that image evolved? To revisit my earlier analogy, throughout my talk, you've been collecting mirror shards. Those of little Adelina and the daring Lola, those of Harriet the author and the lyrical Sarah, and all the others. Now that you've fit those shards into your mirror, how has that reflection changed? Not just of the past, but of the world around you as well. Do you perhaps picture the women in this very room differently? Knowing that, like the ladies we explored today, every single one of them have experienced hardships and triumphs and are weaving beautifully complex stories of their own? I want to thank you all for listening. It's been a real pleasure. After I take any questions, I invite you to come up and explore the pieces on display here. Yes.
Ludwig of Bavaria that you talked about, was that Ludwig the Mad or was that his son?
I didn't hear that nickname associated with Ludwig I, so I don't think it was him.
What's that one?
I read a fair few biographies that talked about that sordid love story, and I never heard him called that. Though I would say destroying an entire country's government for the sake of your mistress might make you a little mad. Anyone else? Yes.
Excellent presentation.
Thank you.
Fabulous. I think you ought to do it like a series, you know. There's so many more interesting women to talk about. So you have to think of that in the future.
It was with a great deal of bitterness that I had to delete some at the end.
Just a minor correction on La Revue de l'Ouest, which is a Revue de l'Ouest that I've been working on since 2014, is that it's not St. Louis's first French language newspaper. It's like, it is the most successful French language newspaper, but we had many attempts at French language newspapers before that time. So,
Thank you.
But
My mistake.
Just for the future, for your talk. So,
Anyone else? Yes.
I was, I mean, as an employee, I guess I'm biased, but I was particularly interested in the way that you presented the staff and the roles that they had played. And did you find it easy, like in the archives, were you finding good representation of them?
Yeah, thank you for asking. One of the biggest collections that I used for all of this is the Mercantile Library's archives. It's incredible, over 175 years, how the staff here have so diligently and carefully preserved their own history and own contributions. There are boxes and boxes of correspondence, executive papers. So I could actually go and pull between about 20 different boxes of Mrs. Kirschner's and about 5 different boxes of Mary Dorward's. We have newspaper clippings of their time. I got the clippings in this presentation from that same collection. It's one of my favorite collections at the library, and I had a wonderful time exploring it for this. Yes.
I thought it was really interesting that when you said that Lola Montez's visit to the Mercantile wasn't mentioned in the minutes. And I was just wondering if you found when you were going through the minutes and the archives, how they spoke about any of the other women.
Yeah.
Perform or speak at the Mercantile.
Yeah, so in the annual reports to the board, which we still make today, The women are mentioned usually in the lecture area. There's also mentions of the concerts. There's areas where they talked about charity fundraisers that women organized. And like Susan B. Anthony is mentioned, Harriet Hosmer is mentioned extensively, that entire tale. I wish I could have gotten to it today. The tale of arranging the artwork, bringing the artwork. And then Harriet Beecher Stowe, one I did talk about, was mentioned in the board report as well, saying she gave a fine reading of several of her works. And that at that same time, actually, one of the broadsides that I have up here, at the same year that Harriet Beecher Stowe spoke, the board report also mentioned a Miss Nielsen, who gave a dramatic poetry reading. So yeah, they were mentioned quite often. That's why I was kind of surprised to not see Lola mentioned, maybe because they weren't quite sure what category to stick her under, a lecture, performance.
Well, let me.
Yeah.
You mentioned that since the earliest days of the Mercantile Library, women have been involved both as members and on the board as well?
The first president of the Mercantile Library was Nancy Neal. So really Mary Dorward broke the glass ceiling of leadership of women. And from there on, it's just continued on. In fact, today, several of our staff are all women, including Julie Dunn Morton, the art curator, myself, Brittany and Alyssa. And so in the earliest days, women were listed as clerks and again, as assistants, but it was really Mary Dorward who kind of shattered that ceiling.
But as
And the board members, Nancy Neal was the first one. Yeah.
Are you gonna put together some kind of abstract of your work on this? It's a great topic, and it'd be a shame not to have all your work, with the other leading women involved in the work. I think it would be a great thing to have.
These last couple of weeks, I've kind of fantasized about this being a publication someday.
excellent.
So
But I love the idea.
no promises, but it's a dream.
But I'd like to second the idea of doing this as a series, because obviously there were many women that you weren't able to include today, other than, glancing references, but fascinating. I mean, there, as you mentioned, Harriet Hosmer, artists and authors. I just think it would be a fascinating topic.
If I had my way, I would have kept you in here for at least 3 or 4 hours. Movies like Lord of the Rings were that long, so you could sit through this that long.
Okay, I think on that note, I'm going to step to the podium.
Were there any questions from Zoom?
I don't have any that were dropped in the chat.
Okay.
While we're waiting, I will just step in and say that, as Sarah pointed out, she's got some wonderful materials up front that you're welcome to come up. We do hope that you enjoy refreshments, but please don't bring refreshments up to the front while you're here. And also, many of these people and the others that she wasn't able to include are included in the exhibition downstairs. So levels 1 and 2, you can see some other amazing material.
Yeah, Kate, thank you. I meant to say that at the end. Kate Chopin's bust is on display, as well as The Awakening. Sally Benson's work's on display, Harriet Hosmer's sculpture. So I highly encourage after this to go check out the exhibit.
We have a lovely portrait of Ruth Bryant, who was president of Mercantile for many years downstairs. On top of the other ones I'm not working.
Yeah.
She was president for many years. So, yeah.
Yeah, if you, when you're down in the old Mercantile area, down on level 1, if you turn left, you see the long tables. Her portrait's over there.
Thanks, Sarah, again for a wonderful